Hello, and welcome to this episode of the World Discord podcast. I'm Joel Ostrow.
Hey Joel, I'm Brian Endless. How you doing?
I'm doing all right, and hopefully this take will work. Um, we are going to be discussing today a genocide that does not get much coverage in the media really at all. Maybe there was a brief period before the pandemic, but really you don't hear much about it anymore, and that's the genocide against the Rohingya population in Myanmar. Now, Myanmar at one time was known, at least in the West, as Burma. Um, it has been ruled almost continuously by a pretty brutal military dictatorship with a brief period of a few years um, of when the country was led by the writer and Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who was perceived or known internationally as a pro democracy activist, or at least an opponent of the dictatorship in Myanmar, many years under house arrest, and on and on. But it has basically been under military dictatorship for decades, one of the more closed regimes on earth. And during Suu Kyi's leadership, the military began a campaign against the predominantly Muslim population of Rohingya. There are Buddhist organizations that have perpetrated the genocide there. It's a fairly complicated situation, and Brian will introduce our guest, who's much more expert on it than I am. I can say that the violence began somewhere around 2016, 2017. Estimates on the number of dead vary wildly. A brief Google search can turn up estimates anywhere from 40,000 dead to hundreds of thousands dead, and the same in terms of refugees, but that certainly amounts in the hundreds of thousands, most of whom have gone to Bangladesh, which has caused massive economic and infrastructure problems for that very poor country as well. So the crisis among the Rohingya is really very much a regional problem. In March of 22, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken formally declared the situation against the Rohingya as a genocide, after a fairly long investigation conducted by the State Department and the UN. There's a long report that you can access online in the Secretary's statement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to introduce our guest today. Brian?
Fantastic. Thank you, Joel. I want to welcome our guest, Simon Billeness. He is the executive director of the International Campaign for the Rohingya. It's a part of the No Business with Genocide coalition. It's a coalition to end genocide broadly. Simon and I have worked together before, as I've worked on post-genocide efforts in Rwanda, and we met through that. So very pleased to have him with us here today. He has worked for over 20 years in the field of human rights with a special focus on Burma and Myanmar. He worked with Oxfam International and Amnesty International on human rights campaigns. And with the Rohingya campaign, my understanding, and I'll ask you to go into more detail with the organization, is that you and the international campaign work to amplify the voice of the Rohingya people with international organizations, governments, corporations, and civil society. I know the last time we tried to get you on a few weeks ago, you were testifying before Congress, which took precedence over us. We understand that. Much more
Not quite
important.
sure why, though.
Much more
They're not going to do anything.
But Simon, welcome, and perhaps you can start us off. Joel did a nice little recap of the situation, but tell us a little bit more. This is a invisible conflict; almost no
Yeah.
one knows about it. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about who the Rohingya are and why they're in trouble here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't really, and Gwen, also, thank you very much for having me. I'm always delighted to, particularly to speak in more of a long format it definitely allows for more discussion and more questions. So I'm
This is the reason we do this podcast, because
Yeah.
we hate 3 minute CNN or other arguments or discussions on things. We want to get some details out here.
I grown a little tired of just doing my little 5 minute 3 questions on Al Jazeera Arabic in a dark room with a headphone in my ear giving me the translation.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyhow, I like to step back a little bit, and I think there's two sort of core tensions within Burma which really explain a lot of the politics and what happens in Burma, and it only goes all the way back to independence from the British, my guys again.
Hmm.
Uh, Always a source of problems in throughout history.
Only about half the world, not quite the entire world. So.
Yeah. We only because we didn't get around to conquering the other half of the world.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
You're welcome.
Had some competition from Spain and France there, but be that as it may. So I think it's important to look at Burma and realize that Burma is a country that has two unresolved questions about it since independence. First of all, Burma is a country that's made up of about between 1/2 to 2/3 ethnic Burmans in the heartland of the country, and then around the border of Burma, there are over 100 different ethnic minorities. And since independence, there's been insufficient nation building. There hasn't been a settlement or a resolution on the issue of what kind of system of government Burma should have, whether it's a unitary state, whether it's a federation, should different ethnic minority areas have their own form of local authority, that, and so on and so forth. And it's been so unresolved that there are many different ethnic minorities who, since independence, have taken up arms and have continued to fight against the Burmese army for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I think the Karen in the southeast is actually the longest running sort of ethnic insurgency in the world in right now. So that's one aspect of Burma that's important to understand, is that the unresolved nature of the relationship between the central government and particularly the ethnic minority states.
So let me stop you for a second before you go into the other here. My understanding is that the name of the country is somewhat contentious. I think it was 1989 when the military junta changed it from Burma to Myanmar, and that has not been accepted every place, although it is official at the United Nations and others. Why do you use Burma instead of Myanmar?
Well, it was definitely contentious in 1989 because people of Burma said that the military didn't have the authority to change the name of the country. Right. And so from 89 through to around the 2010s, you could tell kind of what side people were on, by whether they used Burma or whether they used Myanmar. Yep. But since then, it's become less contentious. Both Burma and Myanmar, they're both derived from the same Burmese word, Bama. At this point, it's certainly a lot less contentious, and I just tend to use Burma and Myanmar interchangeably, as do many other people.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because I very clearly remember back in the 90s and early 2000s, because I do this on the United Nations side, this used to be a huge point of contention with the junta wanting everybody to say Myanmar, and opponents of the junta at the UN would say Burma, even though the official name
guys,
was Myanmar.
we had a problem.
So people used to be very up in arms about it.
It's from the internet for reasons I don't quite understand.
That's I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
And
you
I
had
am
two points.
I lost you
at the beginning, and you got through
and
the
why
first
is it
one.
still...
Do we remember what the second one was?
Oh, I definitely remember. But
okay.
But yeah, I mean, so you got to look at Burma as, first of all, as suffering from insufficient nation building, and the relationship between the majority Burmans and the ethnic minorities in the border areas, that has never reached any kind of political settlement. Uh, and you still have a situation with many uh, of the ethnic minorities having their own armed forces and continuing to fight against the Burmese military. So with that situation, the Burmese military, one of the reasons they justify their dictatorship and their power is they claim to be the only force that can keep the Union of Myanmar together. They say that without the army, the Union of Myanmar will disintegrate, become like Yugoslavia. Um, and and to a certain extent, the military has managed to unite the country. Since the military coup in February 2021, we've seen an amazing uniting of the majority Burmans and the ethnic minorities together, united against the military,
Right.
and resisting the military
Yep.
coup, and in a way that's unprecedented in Burmese history. To the extent now that you've got the People's Defense Forces under the Democratic National Unity Government of Myanmar. That's made up of people who are actually elected in the elections in 2020, but the military refused to let them take up their seats and form a government. The NUG's People's Defense Forces are working pretty closely with the different ethnic minority resistance organizations and their armed groups, and they've succeeded in liberating now over half of the country in terms of territory. And to be understood, the two big cities in the Burman heartland, Mandalay and Yangon, these are technically under the control of the military, but there's no support for the military in the big cities. Right after the coup, the big cities were just taken over by demonstrations by this new civil disobedience movement, and so the military has no support in those big cities, even though they the cities are sort of notionally under their control. Yeah, they still rule about half of the country and shrinking. And right now we're working to deprive the military of their means to stay in power, which right now is simply access to hard currency, access to arms, access particularly to jet fuel, because which they need because in the areas over half of the country that they don't control, they've been doing airstrikes on civilian areas, and also going at their legitimacy. Denying them the ability to represent Burma on the international stage.
But the military still rules. Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. I mean, the Burmese military is deeply unpopular, deeply corrupt. It has no legitimacy other than force of arms.
But when I
And
spoke to,
what you see,
there's a
around the
Rohingya
world,
cultural center in Chicago.
we see a lot of similar regimes like
founded
this.
by a survivor of the
And get some
genocide.
kind of popular
And
support
I
and
had
some
him
kind of
Carter
legitimacy.
University to Benedictine to
These
speak.
corrupt military
And
dictators suddenly
it was extraordinarily
decide that they are the
complicated because it
defenders
sounded
of that country's
the military
dominant
is not a
ethnicity
monolith, and it
and
sounded
dominant
like there
faith.
was some faction of the military connected
And
to these
what you see,
extremist Buddhist
like the so-called
groups that
monks,
were
or
perpetrating the
these so-called extreme
genocide.
Buddhists.
Is
I'm a
is
Buddhist,
that your
and as far
understanding,
as I'm concerned,
or
these
did
guys
I
are not Buddhists.
misunderstand,
These are
or how
ultra nationalists.
who started it?
These are groups that have been created by the Burmese military, guided by the Burmese military, and these are just ultra nationalists who shave their head, put an orange robe. It does not make them a monk. It does not make them a Buddhist leader, no matter what they say.
Okay.
Okay. Real quick before we move forward into the Rohingya, who internationally is still supporting
Hmm.
the military government? How are they staying afloat, and where do they get their money and their arms from?
Well, they've got support from Russia. They've got some limited and kind of conditional support from China. Um, and they have some allies within the ASEAN countries, most notably Thailand, which buys natural gas from Burma, as does China as well.
Right.
And that gas is actually um, one of the main sources of foreign currency for the regime.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, and there are some other countries in the ASEAN who are more gentle on the junta, like Laos, like Cambodia, like Vietnam, and some countries in ASEAN that are more critical, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, Singapore to a certain extent. So
Yeah.
that's where they get their support from. I mean, it's an extractive state. Um, where the military gets its money through sales of oil and gas, sales of gems, some rare earths, uh, although they've lost control of the area where the rare earths are now. And just recently, also timber, and of course, also heroin and yaba, methamphetamines, and there's also um, cyber scam centers in Burma as
Oh,
well.
okay.
And
So they've got everything. They've got
yeah,
resources, drugs, and cyber.
yes, they got the full they got the full range of extractive rents that they can rely on to a certain extent. But again, with each of those examples,
Mhm.
we've been degrading their ability to get that money.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So with all of this going on and with all the different groups, it does sound like the Rohingya have always been and are still getting the short end of the stick here, and they're the ones that are put into
Yeah.
harm's way. Can you talk a little bit about how that started, and then we can get to how it's progressed and where it's at?
Yeah, I mean the Rohingya are doubly discriminated against as an ethnic minority, and also because they are predominantly
Oh,
Muslim.
fun.
And
Yeah.
again, the Burmese military has raised this boogeyman again through their ultra nationalist allies that the Rohingya are going to take over the country, as going to become like Indonesia, uh, and which is ridiculous. I mean, Muslims make up about 4% of the population. Um, this is not going to happen. In fact, the Rohingya have been one of the ethnic minorities least likely to pick up arms and resist the government. They certainly have. Uh, they don't have the same armed forces that the ethnic Rakhine do, or the Kachin, or the Karen, or the Shan, or the Wa, or many others. So what we saw, what we've seen is like several waves of genocide. As we know, genocide occurs over time, and you've seen in the 1990s, and again in 2012, and again in 2016, and then finally to a much larger extent in 2017. You've seen attacks on Rohingya communities that have driven over 1 million Rohingya into Bangladesh as refugees, to the extent now that there are more Rohingya living in Bangladesh than there are in Burma.
Wow. And the refugee camps in Bangladesh, we can go through more of the genocide, but they're just horrific conditions, is my understanding. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, they're confined to the camps. They do not have access to take up any kind of employment. so they can't get access to just basic livelihood.
Yeah.
Um, they're reliant on rations, which is at a barely above starvation level. Um, and they're also denied uh, any kind of education above the elementary level. In fact, we've you know we have knowledge of Rohingya who are able to sneak out of the refugee camps and pursue even higher education, and do so without the knowledge of the Bangladesh authorities. That's
Yeah, they face discrimination in Bangladesh as well, right? The Rohingya. That's what I've been told. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, they did create this island called Basan Char. It's off the coast of Bangladesh, and as you can imagine, it's very prone to
Hmm.
flooding, particularly as sea levels rise. Um, it does have, they to try and draw Rohingya there. They it has better facilities than in the inland refugee camps around Cox's Bazar, but the most Rohingya refuse to move there. And it wasn't clear whether the Rohingya who were moving there voluntarily or not.
Well, Bangladesh also, if I'm right, I
So
remember
let's go
stories they were
back,
trying to move
Simon, if
that
we
refugee
can,
camp
just to
to
tell us
some
a little bit
small
more about the
island, quite a
genocide. So you
distance
mentioned it
from
was in
the
multiple
mainland.
periods. How
Uh,
did it
and I remember
start?
hearing a lot of
Obviously, discrimination
international
against the
protest against
minority. Who
the
was
country doing that.
involved in it?
How
Was it
did that end up?
widespread? Is this just mostly military that's doing it?
Yeah.
What are the details here?
Well, I refer to Rakhine State in southwest of Burma
Hmm.
as the deep south of Burma. The deep south of Burma, yeah, and it's traditionally the Rohingya have been denied
Mm.
education. Um, uh, they've been denied a lot of economic rights, and they've also been uh, they've had their citizenship stripped from them. And Amnesty International did a very good report
Yeah.
where they characterized the historic treatment
Hmm.
of the Rohingya as a form of apartheid. And when Amnesty calls something apartheid, they don't do that
Oh yeah.
lightly.
Yeah, because the citizenship stripping was written into the Constitution, right? If I
Mhm.
remember correctly, yeah.
Yeah. So, the Rohingya have never been a recognized ethnicity. There are actually 135 recognized ethnicities
Wow.
in Burma. The Rohingya is not one of them. Yep. So, um, so you have that situation. Um, but then I think what happened in 2017. And my interpretation of this is that it's interesting that the Burmese military deployed extra troops in Burma before in Rakhine State before um, this attack on a number of police stations in Burma by the Arakan Rohingya
Yeah.
Salvation Army (ARSA),
Yeah. Yeah.
and subsequently ARSA has been uh, actually recruiting Rohingya from the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar to fight for the military.
Okay.
So
Wow.
so the question remains, whether the military had, kind of put ARSA up to attacking, these 14 police stations to use that as an excuse to attack Rohingya communities and drive over 700,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh, starting in August of 2017. And I think it was also a political move by the military because it then put Aung San Suu Kyi in, who was at that point, leading the civilian part of this civilian military hybrid government. It put her in an impossible political position because they'd already whipped up a lot of, uh, they'd they had exploited but also exacerbated the prejudice that existed in Burmese society against the Rohingya and against Muslims. And it put Aung San Suu Kyi in a position where she would either oppose this and oppose these attacks on the Rohingya and yeah, and also risk losing some of her popular support, which has always been her biggest strength. At the same time, and then, but if she defended the army, then that and which she actually we ended up doing. She ended up defending the army, and so she lost a lot of the support that she once had with the international community. So they put her in a lose-lose situation, and I think that was deliberate.
Yeah, and for those who don't know about her, she was known around the world as a human rights hero for her work on democracy in Burma and Myanmar. And then this happens. Did this? Yeah.
And end up in house arrest again. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and this
Yeah.
this definitely tarnished her. Did this tarnish her internally, Simon, or was the fact that it was it not a big deal because she was going against this minority group that had always been tarnished and that had always been discriminated against? How do people internally view her change on this?
I mean, I think she's never been Aung San Suu Kyi has never been
That's
a supporter of the Rohingya. Uh, and I think I understand Aung San
yeah.
Suu Kyi is that she's primarily a political leader,
And as a
uh,
dissident, Brian, like
and
almost, yeah,
she's not
like
she's
Sharansky
not
was a
a sort of
dissident to
apolitical
Refusnik in the Soviet
uh,
Union. Like
an
she
apolitical
was
leader
really
like say
sort of a
Gandhi.
dissident
She's a
hero and known
political leader
worldwide
like
for her
a
resistance to
Václav
dictatorship.
Havel, like a Nelson Mandela.
Right.
And so when the military started to relax the situation in Burma in 2012 and make concessions uh, to the democracy movement and the international community to get the sanctions off their back, um, she made the decision that she was going to enter politics. Continue to be in politics because she was already leading the National League for Democracy that actually won an election back in 1990.
Yeah.
And so she fought the election in 2015 under the constitution that was written by the military, which reserved a lot of power to the military.
Right.
But her party, the National League for Democracy, ended up winning a majority of seats in parliament. And because of that, because the president was elected by the parliament, the president was from her party as well, the National League for Democracy. And even though there's a provision of the Constitution that the military wrote that restricted her from becoming president, she created this new position called state councillor and was kind of continued to be the sort of de facto president. Yes, without the title.
Yeah, it makes a
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. De facto president, right?
I
But you
I
painted a
think
more
I think
sympathetic
I think she does
description of
bear
her than I have read
a
since
degree of complicity.
since
in the genocide.
the latest waves
Not
of
just
genocide
from
broke out around
not speaking out
2017.
against it, not opposing it,
And I find
even
it
though she
fairly
did not have the power to
convincing.
stop the army from doing this. I mean, the army was not the army's never been
The
under the
notion that
control of the
she was in
civilian
a
government.
lose-lose situation.
Under the Constitution, the
Is it your
the
understanding
president does
that
not appoint the head of the army or the head of
you described her as never having
or
been
the
a
head of
particular
sort
supporter
of national security?
of Rohingya
It's all
rights?
military.
Was she at
But
all complicit in the outbreak of the atrocities
she and
against the
her
Rohingya,
government,
or do you believe she was separate
echoed the
from that and put
military's
in a position
claims
of
that
no
the
position
military
of
was,
responding?
had been
Like, did
attacked
she have a hand
by
in
these
it actively?
terrorists, and this is a national security operation. She downplayed what was clearly attacks on civilian communities, and she even went to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice, where Myanmar was being investigated for the genocide of the Rohingya, and she defended the army. She did not have to do that, but she went there. She went to The Hague, and she spoke up to defend the army. Um,
Hmm. And for listeners who don't know, you say she was in politics, a politician, but her political activism was almost entirely like her
I mean,
stature.
it really
I
does,
think internally, but
clearly raise
certainly
questions about her
externally,
values
was
and about
almost
her political
entirely
judgment.
around this
But I think
aura
you also have to
of
understand that
fearlessness in
that
standing up
when
to
she was
military
released
rule, to the atrocities of the military
from house
dictatorship,
arrest
right?
around 2010, 2011,
Enduring long house arrest and persecution
essentially
um,
she and her party
against
struck a deal
herself
with
as
the
leader
military
of the
that
so-called
they
pro-democracy
would
movement. I say
they
so-called
would
now, right? It's like it's
operate
not like
under
this
the
is someone
military written
who
constitution.
lacked
They would fight
the
elections in
history of
2015,
standing up to the dangers of
and then subsequently fought
opposing
elections in
military
2020.
dictatorship, right? That was her entire
Won
political
overwhelmingly in both
persona. And
cases.
so
But
to not do that
she made the
in the face
decision
of this
to operate
genocide
under
really
the
stands
military's
out and
constitution,
raised
and
for me
to
questions about
it's
her.
all part of
And I
a
think for much of
deal
the
that she
international
struck.
community.
And so, yeah,
as you were saying, that's the politician side.
that's the politician side, and
Hmm.
and 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 she did not pursue accountability for the military for all of its crimes that it committed up till then. So so she was in this uneasy military civilian hybrid government where the military still retained enormous power.
Hmm.
Uh, and yes, I mean, she definitely tried um, to play this very uneven hand as well as she could. I mean, there was efforts to try and change the constitution, but the military set up the constitution so that the constitution could only be changed by a vote of 75% of parliament plus
Okay.
one. And the parliament also contained
Yeah.
25% military officers appointed
Yeah.
by the military. So it was an essential, block on any changes to the constitution that they had written. So yes, uh, it was a period of uneasy cohabitation, uh, and And finally, in 2020, when the Aung San Suu Kyi's party, National League Democracy, won yet another majority in that parliament. Even though they could only run for 75% of those seats, they still got a majority in parliament again in 2020. That's when the head of the army, Min Aung Hlaing, decided that, even under this favorable constitution, even under this, what was a very sweet deal for the military, it wasn't enough for him. And he launched a military coup. He wouldn't let the parliamentarians take up their seats that they had won. And February 1st, 2021, that was the latest in this series of military coups over history, and that's where we find ourselves now.
So, Simon, let's move back to the Rohingya and tell us a little bit about the work your organization is doing. What should we know about the dangers that they're facing now? You talked a little bit about their life in Cox's Bazar in the island. I know there have also been issues with people fleeing by boat and with sex trafficking and some slavery that's gone on. Can you give us some details on how bad the situation is now?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, we're now in what we call like the boat sailing season, where we're seeing refugees, fleeing Bangladesh to usually using using human traffickers, and to get to Thailand, to get to Malaysia, to get to Indonesia. We're seeing again boats arriving off the coast of Indonesia, and there being again a whole song and a dance over whether those refugees are going to be allowed to come on shore. And also we have situation now in Rakhine State is that the military has basically lost control of Rakhine State to the ethnic Rakhine Arakan army. And now the question is, there's a great deal of concern about how Rohingya inside Burma, inside Rakhine State, how they've been caught up in this war, forcibly recruited by both sides, Arakan army and the military, and also how there've been, how there's been, all kinds of attacks in civilian areas in Rohingya communities that have caused a number of further Rohingya refugees to flee to Bangladesh. Just over. I mean, now there are more Rohingya in Bangladesh than there are in Burma, and also hundreds of thousands of Rohingya in Malaysia, Indonesia. There's a large community in Saudi Arabia. There's a big diaspora. They're one of the world's largest stateless peoples at this point.
Yeah, is it numbers around 100,000 still there as an estimate I've seen, or is it more or less than that? Do you know?
I think that's pretty close. It's hard to tell, frankly. And many are living in internally displaced camps.
Well, that was my curiosity. Like, what is the size of the remaining Rohingya population in Rakhine State, and what percentage?
Those are more like concentration camps.
What percentage does that constitute?
Senator Dick Durbin
pre-genocide population
the internally displaced camps in Rakhine State, and he said they reminded him of concentration camps.
Yeah,
right.
No, it's just horrific. So, what is the international community doing about this? If anything, I mean, we don't see anything about it. I know you advocate for it. Are there some positives out there, or is it all just bad news and we need to get the word spread more?
I think there are some positive aspects of what's going on, and definitely we need to get more of the word out, particularly as we have two excellent
tiny
bills in
percentage
right now
compared to the original population.
We have the Rohingya Genocide Accountability and Protection Act, HR 8936, and we also have the Brave Burma Act, HR 8863.
Yeah.
And I consider these two bills to be an effective kind of 1-2 punch against the junta. The Rohingya Gap Act, as it's called, it's building on, as you mentioned previously, U.S. Determination that the Myanmar military has committed genocide against the Rohingya. And as we know, under the Genocide Convention, which the U.S. is a signatory of, there is a duty for signatories to hold those committing genocide to account, and also to prevent further atrocities as well and further genocide. And so, built into that is funding and U.S. support for international accountability mechanisms. Even though the U.S. is, shall we say, wary of using the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, we got the U.S. has funded a lot of the investigative work into the Rohingya genocide, other mass atrocities in Burma. They funded the IIMM, the Independent Investigating Mechanism for Burma, that was set up by the UN, and that has been gathering up all of this testimony and all this information that can then be used in courts of international law or national courts using universal jurisdiction, like the case in Argentina right now. And so, we're getting, the bill is designed to get the kind of support that we can reasonably expect to get out of the U.S.
Right.
Also, it authorizes more money for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and is part of continuing to get the international community all to chip in and make sure that Bangladesh isn't bearing the entire burden of almost all these refugees.
And that's one of the reasons and one of the main emphases of the Rohingya Cultural Center here is to advocate for support, or at least it was. I don't know if it still is. There's a lot of resentment of Bangladesh for what Rohingya refugees see as persecution by the government, but at least those who have made it to the U.S. and the gentleman who runs that center, he at least acknowledged to me, part of the problem is that Bangladesh lacks the resources, the means, and is kind of left on its own to handle this enormous influx. And Bangladesh, it's not new to being a poor country, one of the poorest countries on earth. Heck, George Harrison did an album about it, like right after leaving the Beatles, right? The Concerts for the People of Bangladesh.
Yeah, the case is still active.
After the floods, it's one of the poorest countries on earth, the least able to handle
not just
all these refugees.
the
So
public
support
podium
for Bangladesh
that the case provided,
to be
but
able
also
to,
the court
for
issued a
these,
number
the
of
refugee
provisional
camps
measures
is really important.
where it
But you did note
directed,
that Aung San Suu Kyi was brought before the International Court of Justice, which was investigating. This is back in what,
preserve evidence
2019, was it? 2018,
and,
2019, the ICJ was involved.
of this.
What has happened
and
there?
sort of-
Brian and I did an episode of this
with the court
podcast
in
on
terms of
the two international courts
of stopping
and
any
what they do
further,
and don't do.
atrocities against
I still
the
find it
Rohingya,
remarkable when the
inside
ICJ
Burma.
actually does
So,
hold hearings on anything.
With the military coup,
so that is a positive
that
step that
became the
there
whole
was at
question of,
least this
who
public
would
use of
represent Burma
an
at
official
the
use
International Court
of
of Justice.
that
Would it be the
mechanism.
junta,
But
or
what
would it be the
came of
National Unity
that, and is
Government?
the ICJ
And National
still
Unity Government did
active
step
on the
up
Rohingya
and
issue
say
at
that
all?
it was the representative of Burma and should be speaking to the court. That is still an issue that remains a contention. And there is a very real question of whether the Burmese military is indeed
Right.
respecting the provisional measures. But I mean, as I said, the military is not in control in Rakhine State anymore. Yeah, it's the Arakan army is now, and so now it's a question of of
Yeah.
recognizing the fact that the Arakan army is the de facto government in Rakhine State, and like any other government, holding them to account for the human rights conditions in Rakhine State, which they control.
Has Myanmar, has anyone in the military been brought before the ICC individually? You mentioned the U.S. was helping to fund some of the background on that. I didn't know if they've been brought there or not, or if there've been investigations.
Yeah, Myanmar, even though they're a signatory of the Genocide Convention, Myanmar is not a signatory to the ICC. But the ICC, Bangladesh is a signatory, and so the ICC, launched an investigation into, again, into the situation of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, to see if that was a way of bringing up Myanmar military leaders.
Sure.
So that's something that is continues to be, I think, actively investigated. As is there's a case in Argentina against the Myanmar military under universal jurisdiction,
Okay.
and that continues as well. That was brought by Rohingya groups.
Yeah.
But I think what we're looking to do right now is yes, with the really just go after the Myanmar military using every point of leverage. So international law remains one point of leverage, but also we're going after the Myanmar military's sources of power, which is the hard currency, the arms, the aviation fuel, and their legitimacy. They're not giving them the right to represent Burma in international forums.
Right. So does that plus the internal civil war, are you seeing a significant weakening of the military, or do they still have control over the main part of the country and they've just lost Rakhine State?
I mean, they've lost Rakhine State. They've lost control over almost all of the borders at this point, whether it's Bangladesh, India, or up in China and Thailand. They're losing ground up in the north in Kachin State. They've lost tremendous ground along the Chinese border in Shan State. And they're also losing to the Karen and the Karenni down in the southeast. And they're also battling ethnic Burman People's Defense Forces in Sagang, and they're getting close to Mandalay in the Burman heartland. So yeah, the military has never been weaker.
Right. So what happens here? I mean, we're getting way off the Rohingya subject here, but these are also tied together. What happens here if the military falls? Would the government still have support, or would there be a fight among the different groups to see who takes control?
I mean, I think what we've seen is this unprecedented unity between ethnic Burmans and ethnic minorities inside Burma. The ethnic minority armies have been working very closely with the National Unity Government and the ethnic Burman People's Defense Forces it's an unprecedented unity, and it's represented in the National Unity Government of Myanmar, which is a multi-ethnic. Uh, uh, it does. There is there's the deputy human rights minister, Ong Chor Mo, is Rohingya. Is also an official Rohingya advisor, uh, and is also
They are.
Rohingya representation in other bodies as well. So I you know I remain hopeful uh, that the new government will if they succeed in toppling the military, that the National Unity Government will deal fairly with will oversee a process that is fair to the different ethnic minorities, including the Rohingya. Yeah, I remain pretty hopeful on this one.
Sure. Yep.
But doesn't include the Rohingya. Oh, it does. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is an area when it comes to Burma. This is an area where the U.S. has shown leadership and
Interesting.
has a degree of moral authority. Um,
Brian, I got one more
the
question, and then maybe you
U.S.,
can ask our
working with the
traditional
European
last question.
Union, Canada,
So
UK, and Australia,
it'll be sad
has
if you
been
say that
um,
my
they've been
understanding here
working
is wrong.
together
But my understanding is that
on
the U.S. is
increasing
not exactly
sanctions
playing
on
a
the
global
Myanmar
leadership
military.
role on behalf of
And
the
so,
Rohingya. And my question is,
they can
who
always go
is
further, but the U.S. is playing a leadership role
outside
in
of
that. The U.S. has also been playing a leadership role
Myanmar? Like, what country is the loudest
the package of
voice
funding for the Rohingya
on
refugees. In
behalf
fact,
of the Rohingya
just
situation
this
and
month,
against the
the U.S. came
atrocities
up
being
with an additional
committed?
120
Or is
million
there, can you
for
not
the
identify,
World
like,
Food
who's the
Program
friendliest country right
in
now?
the
I guess is my
refugee camps in
question.
Bangladesh. The case of the International Court of Justice was brought by Gambia on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. So the OIC has been another big supporter of the Rohingya, and Gambia has been the country that has really stepped out, but with the support of other OIC countries.
I
Yeah,
guess that they were probably in a leadership role the month that it happened.
Hmm.
God bless Gambia.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Simon, we have a traditional last question for our guests, and we're going to let you solve this whole situation. But I'm going to break it into two parts here. The first is, I think you've said this already, but if
Hmm.
you can tell us in the first half, what do the Rohingya people need the most practically right now? What will help them the most? And then the second half of the question, we're going to give you a magic wand,
Interesting.
and I'm going to give you 5 or 10 years out. What do you think this
Okay.
could look like in the best of all worlds? What would it take to get to a good place in the next 5 or 10 years?
Okay.
I would say what the Rohingya need is support, political support and
I did not
funding
have Gambia on my
uh,
bingo card.
for
So.
immediate humanitarian relief, where it's needed for Rohingya refugees, but
Yeah,
also I
yeah,
think political support and also funding support for the Rohingya to uh, develop their own institutions, develop their own organizations, and be able to advocate
yeah.
for themselves with the skills and the strength and the coordination that's needed. Um, if there's a magic wand, what I love to see? I mean, I think what I'd love to see would be the Myanmar military's collapse on the battlefield, and um, finally get the Burmese army out of Burmese politics, get it out of the Burmese economy, get them in the barracks under political control. I mean, I think at this point, I think the Burmese people will want nothing less than simply abolishing the army and creating a new army in the nucleus of the People's Defense Forces, and finally get the Burmese army out of Burmese society
Yeah.
in its current form.
A quick question this raises for the Rohingya people: do they get to come back at that point?
I mean, if you talk to Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, yeah, they want to go back to Burma. They, None of them want to go back to Burma now, but ultimately, they do want to return to Burma. They want to go back to their traditional lands and their traditional homes. They don't want to go back to another camp. They don't want to go from a camp in Bangladesh to a camp in Burma.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't help
And
the
they don't want to go back unless they get their citizenship restored. And yeah, and so that's
That
what
was my
Rohingya
question
tell me
too.
that
Like
they
it
want.
sounds like about 80% of the
And I mean,
population of Rohingyas
I
outside
was
of Myanmar now.
talking to
Do they go back,
talking to
or would they want
Rohingya.
to?
There really
Do they
are right
trust
now
going
sort of
back?
three main groups of Rohingya. There are the Rohingya who have remained in Burma. There are the Rohingya refugees. But also there's also Rohingya diaspora. Like the
Right.
like a lot of the community in Chicago around the Rohingya Culture Center, who are
What I've been
predominantly a
told as well.
Rohingya who made their way to the U.S. from Malaysia and from other countries, um, uh,
Right.
and and so they're more diaspora than they are refugees.
And they probably don't want to go back as
That's an
long as the
important
military
distinction.
junta is still in
It's certainly
control, right? So
a distinction
probably a
that
condition is
Rohingya
what you said, the
refugees
collapse on the
feel
battlefield, right?
is important. So so there are sort of like three different types of Rohingya based on their situation. There are Rohingya who have lived in Saudi Arabia for decades, and barely speak the language anymore. Uh, and so I at one point I did talk to refer to the Rohingya as being one of the largest stateless peoples in the world. I often get corrected by Rohingya who say no, actually we do have a state. It's Burma.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, yeah, the people do want to return home. I'm working by my colleague, International Campaign for Rohingya, Lucky Kareem, who is a Rohingya refugee who she and her family fled Burma in 2017, lived in the refugee camps for 6 years, and they were one of the first families of Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh to be resettled in the U.S. Now living in Chicago, and right now she is in learning and improving her Burmese, so
Okay.
that you know she will be in a much better
Yeah.
position to go back to Burma and
Mhm.
and interact and build a relationship with the Buddhist Burmese.
Let's hope. And interestingly for us, we talk about a lot of crises around the world. This is one that might actually be moving in a good direction for the people, and we can a little bit of hope for the future. It sounds
I am more often than not cautiously optimistic.
good. That's fantastic. Simon, on that note, thank you very much. We love cautiously optimistic. It's hard to get better than that when you're talking crises. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's been fantastic. I also want to thank Andy Miles, our producer, and thank all of you for listening in. And we hope you'll join us again next week. Have a good one, folks.